Ladies and gentlemen, it's the worst movie you've ever seen.
Oh no. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know you've read the title. I know you know what we're covering today. This is going to be quite the episode, and I'm really excited to get into it. First, we'll go through our introductions, and then we'll talk a little bit about this movie. Oh, good Lord.
Starring the most punchable member of Community.
Oh my God.
This is
Dude,
gonna be fun, y'all.
this just started and it went off the rails. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Not That Bad, a movie podcast, the show where we take movies that people don't like and we tell you why they're not that bad. And boy, do we have
Sometimes we do that.
sometimes, and boy, do we have a special episode for you today. I am one of your hosts. My name is Connor, aka Tupac Kazam, aka Dumpty, pronounced with the umpty. And I am so excited to be welcoming you guys to our show today, along with my illustrious co-host, Mr. Gabe Tice. Gabe, how are you doing today, buddy? I
This
should
is
ask just for
this
the
is
formality.
this is the most that this podcast has felt like a job.
Oh no! Oh
So
no!
I
Oh, more
just
than Waterworld?
that's a really good question. It's kind of a
Oh,
shame that, kind
that'll
of
be
back to
interesting.
back, I feel like we're gonna have to do something really positive after this episode to restore the kind of good energy we were trying to bring out into the world. But if you like the bad tempered, angry, ranty uh kind of content, then well, you are in luck, partner. At least from my
Well,
side. I mean, we need to figure out how Connor feels about this because this is Connor's pick, and the whole time I'm watching this movie, I'm like, did he pick this to fuck with me? Did he? Because my sensibilities, the kind of stuff that I dig and that I don't dig, and I think you knew
yeah.
kind of where I would lean towards this.
I'll get into that as we go, I
Okay,
think. But
all right.
ladies and gentlemen, as you've seen from the title, as you've heard us allude to since the opening of this episode, we are covering the 1991 film Nothing But Trouble. Originally entitled Valkenvania, this movie was set to be a love letter to horror comedies by writer and director Dan Ackroyd. Very surprising writer and director. You look at the cast of this, you see Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase,
Mhm.
you see Demi Moore, you
John
see
Candy.
John Candy, and you wonder how did this movie slip through the cracks? We're going to get into that a little bit, but first, let's talk a little bit about what this was supposed to be. Of course, supposed to call back to the horror comedies of Dan Aykroyd's childhood, as well as with some of the gross out features and gruesome features of modern horror during that time. This is
Hmm.
after we've had sequels of Friday the 13th and of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Wonder if he was a fan of that at all. And yeah, it's interesting, man, because Aykroyd did write and direct this film, and he was given free reign over the production. The studio had no interference whatsoever. Jesus Christ. Whatsoever during the production of the film. He was given free reign. He let the departments that were handling different areas of the film, such as production design, makeup effects, just go absolutely crazy with this. And for a while, he even had his actors had their own playback monitors to direct their own performance until John Hughes showed up and said, "You cannot do this. Please stop doing this." And he said, "Okay, I will stop." So there's a lot that's interesting. John Hughes was actually one of the people who recommended that Aykroyd direct this. He had written it, brought it to John Hughes and John Landis. Neither of them
They were
were
like,
going.
"Fuck that."
So it's interesting. So they encouraged him to direct it because they told him they didn't quite think that they could capture his vision the way he could. And they said, this is a great script. Please direct it. We think we know somebody will pick it up. Sure enough, Warner Brothers picks it up. And it's funny because there's been a lot of rumors about this movie about how Chevy Chase was to work with because of how he's dealt with the rest of his career. But weirdly enough, he was said to have been a beacon of light on set. He was the one encouraging Dan Aykroyd when he got down on himself and worried about some of the things to put in the movie. He encouraged it to make it his vision and continue with what he has. Um, really interesting. However, all of this freedom did not last because the studio had final say in the editing room, and they definitely chopped out a lot of this movie. The complete cut of this is said to have been quite different, a lot of more horror elements to the horror comedy. Um, and man, this was immediately shit on by critics. I mean, it did not take long for this to be shut on at all. Roger Ebert famously hated this movie and refused to even draft a written review. He hated it that much. Man, our guy Roger Ebert, man, this really fucked with him. I'm curious to see if it fucked with you in the same way. But what do you think of little Raj, as I like to call him, not getting to put his review through for this in a written form?
There's only so much you can pay a person, you know. There's only so much that you can make a person do. You know what I mean? Like I think there were probably kind of like labor laws in place to protect Roger Ebert.
Oh
It's really
no!
interesting though, right? Because okay, so we're dealing with an SNL alum movie, which is kind of its own little subgenre of comedy. The
Yeah,
but uh, usually the line of attack on SNL alum movies are that they feel like, let's say, uh, sketches that have been kind of stretched out to feature length, that sketches that have no business being a feature film. And that's really not the problem here. This I was like trying to imagine Dan Ackroyd, and you know he was kind of known on SNL for having some of the more interesting ideas, some of the more kind of out
yeah,
there concepts. I think he came up with Coneheads,
yes,
um, and then right after SNL, this is kind of a fabled thing, a famous story, but he came up with the idea of Ghostbusters initially as this mammoth, epic, 200 million budget kind of like uh, fantasy horror action adventure thing.
yeah,
And I think it was Harold Ramis or Ivan Reitman came in and worked with him to turn it into what we know and love to be Ghostbusters today.
yes.
It doesn't sound like Dan Aykroyd had any of that kind of influence here. It sounds like a lot of the people in his life and his circle told him to just kind of run with it. You know, this feels like a completely unrestrained, unfiltered product of Dan Aykroyd's imagination. And you know, I said some mean things earlier, but you at least have to admire, and we'll get into this, but you have to admire the complete level of thought and creativity on display. Like you said, he
Yeah,
told his department people to go wild, and go
they did.
wild they did.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and for better or for worse, as we'll see as we go on, because people really don't like this. Roger Ebert was far from the only person to not like this movie, as it currently sits with a 12% Rotten Tomatoes score, a D plus on Cinema Score, a 5 out of 10 on IMDb, and a 2.4 out of 5 on Letterboxd to go with its decorated Razzie nominations, 5 nominations and 1 win, which went to Dan Aykroyd for his role in the film. Um, it's sad to see you know, and this is going to be interesting to talk about as we go, but with the complete vision, it's sad to see somebody's vision and sort of their baby get destroyed by critics, because this absolutely was.
Uh-huh.
There was even a rumor that you actually made me aware of through something that you had sent me, that apparently there was a rumor that Aykroyd actually sent apology letters to the entire cast, which is really sad to see, because you know, watching him do press for this movie, you could tell it's something he really cared about. And we're going to get into how we feel about it throughout this episode. And I say we start with the good stuff. I hope you have something.
Oh, yeah,
And
I have things.
let's get started with that, man. Kick us off here in the good section.
Yeah, I I don't want to do the backhanded compliment thing of like, oh, he tried, everybody tried. So I'm only gonna really list the things that I actually did get enjoyment
Yeah,
out of, that I admired. Because like I said, I did admire to an extent just this how hard he swung for the fences. Okay, I will say that there are a number of people that I love in the cast. And while I don't think this is the career highlight for really anybody, I they brought a really welcome presence to a movie that I think really needed some warmth, some heart. This is kind of like a zany to the point of almost being gross out and off-putting. So to see people like John Candy, especially, come in, he just really brought an energy to the movie that I desperately needed, because this was marketed as a comedy, and save for a few kind of funny reaction shots from Chevy Chase, it's really, there's nothing almost to indicate that, aside from some of uh, the casting choices. So again, I think it's kind of a mix, but overall, great to see people like John Candy and Chevy Chase got a few laughs out of me.
Oh, dude, like I love the cast in this. Uh, I love pretty much everybody that was cast. I think played exactly the way that they were supposed to. Great to see the mailman from my one of my favorite comedies of all time, Better Off Dead, in this. And honestly, man, like it's so funny because we'll get into some of the audience complaints later, but a lot of that is thrown, or some of that is thrown at the cast in some ways. And for me, man, like that was in it added for me, it added a lot of charm to the movie, especially somebody who I think is an unsung hero of film, genuinely one of my favorite actors of all time, John Candy. I think he
Yeah.
just comes into this, and even though one of his characters kind of disappears for a good portion of the movie, I think he more than makes up for that with his other character that he plays. Of course, he plays a brother and sister duo, one of which is a mute female. And so, very interesting performances from all of them. It's interesting because, and I want to highlight something, and if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, let me know.
Mhm.
But for something to not be a career highlight doesn't necessarily mean their performance is also a career lowlight. And I think
A
this
low light.
film, right,
No,
like I
no,
don't
yeah,
and I think that's what you're saying, is that
yeah.
this may not be like the film that you think of when you think of these people, but I think they all add their own charm, and I do really dig the cast, and I will admit I was actually laughing quite a bit throughout this movie. I don't know if it just hit me in the right spot or what, but especially this viewing, um, man, like I was cracking up the whole time, and that was due to just how the cast is. I love all these guys.
Yeah, I can name you a handful of moments that made me laugh or chuckle or guffaw, which is like close enough. That's close enough.
I think
At
so.
at some point during a fight scene, Chevy Chase steps into Dan Ackroyd's, like one of those like floor toilets, like that. That like
Yeah, he steps into a bedpan. Oh
yeah,
my
bedpan.
god.
That's right. Oh my god, I forgot
Yeah.
the name. And he has to like kind of kick Dan Aykroyd with it. Okay, that got me. And Chevy Chase, I mean, I have a few things to say about him as a person. I have nothing new to add to this. I'm not
Right.
gonna blow anybody's mind by
Yeah,
revealing that
I
he is
don't
an
think we're not breaking any news on Chevy Chase here.
right. He was such a strange anomaly to me throughout his whole career. Like, he was a really talented guy who shot himself in the foot with his just like a really tangible sense of narcissism. Even his best performances, I'd say, have that element to it. I think he must have been confused about the tone of the movie, because that's kind of the major vibe I got from him. That being said, I was pleasantly surprised that he didn't like there was not this kind of smugness that reeked off the screen the way it usually does with Chevy Chase.
Yeah, like I'm one of those people who, there are times where I can separate the art from the artist. There are times where I don't make that effort. And with Chevy, I do make
Mhm.
that effort because he was such a huge part of my childhood growing up watching Christmas Vacation. And as I've grown older, watching all of the rest of his performances, I can definitely see what you're saying there. And
Mhm.
there's this arrogance about him, and it's really sad to see because he does have so much talent. And I think
Yeah,
him more than anybody, especially like throughout the 80s, he could just deliver these lines sometimes that under any other circumstances would not be funny, but the way that he says them is very funny. He doesn't feel like he could he feels like a comedic actor, but he also feels like he doesn't need to be pigeonholed as a comedic actor because of the way that he delivers some things and the way that he's able to go about his performances. But I agree. I think this feels very out of his element for a good and bad reasons. I'll get a
Hmm.
little bit into that when I get to that section, but it's really interesting to watch this. It's actually interesting for me to watch the entire cast because I think all of them sort of deliver a performance here that is very different than anything that they've really done before, except for John Candy, because he's kind of just a genuine dude in everything he's in.
Well, I mean, he
But
goes out of his comfort zone
well, yes, he
with
does with the female character.
yeah, with one of his characters, which was another huge mixed bag for me.
Okay,
And I think I'm going to reserve that for the negative because that's where I lean. But it is interesting, like Demi Moore. I've never seen her take a role like this. I mean,
right.
I'm not a huge I didn't like really follow her career very well. I've only seen her in a handful of things. Um, she she felt like a good sport to me.
Yeah.
I mean, for somebody who is one of those like Hollywood starlets, she's in this like gross movie acting opposite of like guys in these disgusting fat suits, and she seemed really game for it. So
Yes.
I really don't have anything bad to say about the actors, with the possible exception of Dan Ackroyd himself, who was directing himself this time.
Mhm.
Which was a new thing for him. And
In two
God,
roles.
it, which is the other role other than the judge?
Bobo.
Oh, he was Bobo.
He was. He couldn't find
Well,
anybody else to play Bobo.
that's fair. Um,
Oh, he
how do you
had,
put
by the
that on
way,
a
he had
freaking
to.
casting call?
I just want to say this about Dan Aykroyd, no matter how you feel about the guy and how you feel about this movie, he had to direct himself in that makeup during those scenes where he was Bobo. I just want everybody to know that.
Yeah,
So
I'm
he was
trying to,
directing the entire cast in that costume.
and the crew. I'm trying to imagine being like, I don't know, a grip or something, and Bobo comes up to you and says, "Hey, I need that.
Hey, I think the lighting's a little weak in this section. I
I
think you
need,
gotta
I need a C stand
reorganize.
there." I don't
He's just
know.
talking. Oh, now, here's the question: did he direct in character? Because
I
that
don't
would be
think.
even better.
He's not a method actor
No,
to
he's
my
not.
knowledge,
I just love the
which
idea of
thank
him
God.
talking in the Bobo voice to all of the
Mm,
cast and crew, telling him like the lighting over here needs to be moved.
yeah, God, I just hope for his sake that like I don't know. I felt kind of weird for him. Like I felt like he was doing something at least bordering on cringe, and
Oh,
nobody had the heart to tell him what was and what was not working. Because he has some pretty funny lines. Don't get me wrong, but there are other times where he just hams it up. Uh, and I love out there comedies. I love weirdness in my comedies when there's a point to it. But I don't like self indulgence. And it wasn't even self indulgence so much as just, a film is a collaborative effort. And if nobody is voicing concerns, or if nobody is, bouncing ideas off of each other, then you kind of end up with this product that is just, you know, very unrefined. And that's how I would describe his performance is unrefined. Damn, we're in the positive section. My bad. This is I don't. Yeah. All right.
oh, well,
All
that's
right.
hey, that's okay. I'll redirect for us, and I'll see what you think about this, and hopefully it
Please
doesn't take
do.
us to a negative realm. Before we both sort of agree on the cast, I think I have much stronger of an opinion in the positive section on the cast,
Yeah.
because I actually do enjoy almost everything that Aykroyd does in his performances in this. I'll be excited to get into that a little later when we talk about that. But dude, I just want to say like Vulcanvania as a whole is a huge positive for me. I know
Yeah.
it's very general, but the look of this town and the look of the people there and the feeling the in a weird way they build like their own world with this town,
They
and I
do.
dig the hell out of it, man. I think it's incredibly unique. It's how do I put this? it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 adjacent. You know, they're similar in some ways,
The
but I
whole
think it takes a
time,
whole left turn to unique, you
the
know?
whole time, I thought of this movie as, what if Dan Ackroyd directed House of a Thousand Corpses?
You know, it's funny that you talk about that because like when just thinking of Vulcanvania and when thinking of like the film as a whole and his just creative input, I just kept thinking of Rob Zombie and Toby Hooper. Like
Yeah.
not in the same way, but like those are two filmmakers that were just in a lot of ways fearless. They want to take
Hmm.
their vision and run with it. And even though Aykroyd was much more reserved throughout the filming and was much more like he was questioning himself and he was very unsure of some things. He was able to complete his vision, and his vision was, while you could base it off of something, while you could connect it to something, and this is how I feel as a movie about this movie as a whole, while you could find connections to different films like House of
Hmm.
a Thousand Corpses or like Texas Chainsaw Massacres, you know, part one and two, you can also say that this is one of the most unique movies ever, and that's how I feel about Vulcanvania as a whole. This
Yeah.
this town they build is just like it's unlike anything you've ever seen before. There's like these industrial pipes in the middle of the road, and it's like very like Rube Goldberg everywhere. It's
It
like very
also,
bizarre.
I feel like this movie has a lot in common with two films we covered recently, Waterworld and the Super Mario Brothers movie. I thought about Super Mario Brothers more than a few times,
Yeah.
especially with those pipes, and some of the makeup effects kind of reminded me of, like, I don't know, the Goombas. And I'm actually going to bounce off that and say something that is a total pro for me. I really enjoyed it about this movie, which is the production design. I actually think when they're riding into the town and the drawbridge goes up and they just pass all these signs that say things like no cussing, and it just looks like this junkyard from hell. I was actually getting pretty interested in the movie. I was getting pretty intrigued,
Yeah.
and that left the feeling of being intrigued didn't exactly leave me. It just sort of,
It
it kind
morphed.
of, it morphed.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, but for that moment, I was actually getting pretty hooked. And I think all the visual gags with this world, with the contraptions and the bizarre layout of this house, really did work for me. I love that there's a train set in the middle of the dining
Oh my
table.
God, it's amazing.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I'm gonna call it the murder ride. I know it's not called that, but it just
Yeah.
reminded me too much of Captain
It's
Spaulding's murder
pretty
ride.
much this is like a real murder ride. It actually
Yeah,
murders you.
it actually murders you. That
Eat your
was,
heart out, Rob Zombie.
I mean, this goes kind of harder than most horror movies that we've at least covered for this podcast, which is a
Yeah.
few.
And
And
it does it in a comedic way, but like it
mhm.
doesn't change the fact that it does take it to that level that not I don't know that any of them that we covered, to your point, has gone that far.
I mean, I can't think of a movie we've covered where people are deposited into a grinder, like a human meat grinder, and then we see their bones getting spat out
Oh,
of a
did
pipe.
you miss that scene in Waterworld? I don't. No, no, but you're right. Like, you know, when we very much started as a very horror centric
Mhm.
podcast, and there are elements that sort of reminded me, like with the skulls and stuff, with like and the rides with like Child's Play 3, and but that's a very different movie. And
Yeah,
I can comfortably say that there's not a movie that we've covered so far that looks anything like this and that utilizes the type of
yeah.
set design that this film does.
Well, I do understand why you would gravitate towards this movie, because it reminded me of a lot of things that I did like. It just put it together with elements that it was hard to say that the it was hard to say that this was the right combination of elements to me, or that Dan Ackroyd is the best guy to deliver this kind of experience. But the production design team did a fantastic job. The makeup effects team
Whew.
did. I mean, it was gross. This was like, The Thing didn't want to make me throw up as much as some of the effects in this movie.
Grosser than so you found Mario Brothers pretty gross.
I
Spoiler
did.
alert for anybody who has not watched our Patreon special. If you'd like to go see our thoughts on Super Mario Brothers, subscribe to our Patreon at any tier. Just throwing that out there. But do you find this film more disgusting than Mario Brothers?
That's a great question to go back and forth on for me because like Mario Brothers was gross in spots and in sections. And when it was gross, it was foul.
And it did
This
so sort of unexpectedly.
unexpectedly because of the brand, because it's Super
Yes.
Mario Brothers. This movie, just looking at Dan Ackroyd, if you're watching this, you can see I have a picture of him behind me. Just looking at that
That beautiful,
was
beautiful man.
a really off-putting thing for me. So it was more like there was this constant like level of grossness versus the
It
roller
didn't
coaster experience.
surpass, right, like it didn't surpass a
Right.
level that was it didn't spike too far. There are times where it maybe went down, but it didn't spike past
It
a
did
certain
spike.
level.
It did
Oh,
spike
it
a
did
few
spike.
times.
Okay, okay.
Only a
Too
few
far.
times. I'm not gonna say too far. Well, it depends on what
Okay.
he was going for. I think. Look,
Well,
I
too
have
far for
no.
your sensibilities. I'm more so.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and I will never know how I feel about this movie. Probably this
Oh
is a
no.
really enigmatic one for me. All I can say is I have no idea how he got this movie made, and I mean, what other reaction would Roger freaking Ebert have to this movie, other than pure hatred? When you know how he felt about movies like The Thing or all those other types of like really extreme kind of VFX films.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up Roger Ebert in this section while we're talking about this stuff because one of the things he said in his television review of this film
Mm-hmm.
was he at one point was talking about how the comedy has to carry this load, and when it doesn't carry the load, he said it's very unfunny, and so when it's not carrying the load, he called it the so-called production value. Is supposedly is what's trying to carry the load, but it fails. And both Siskel and Ebert did not have anything nice to say about this film, and I think that's really interesting when I was watching that review and when I was seeing what they were talking about because it's sort of like they saw everything as disgusting and dirty and gross, and so it
Mm-hmm.
therefore went underappreciated for them. Do you think you fall more on the side of them when it comes to the gross out factors and the dirt and the grime that's on this film, or do you find yourself using that more as the tool for what you like about the production design and the production, the so-called production
The
value of this
so-called
movie?
that's one. Yeah, yeah.
He was so butthurt about this movie, man. he
Roger
he was not happy, dude. He gave The
Roger.
Devil's Rejects 2 thumbs up, and this is what we like. I don't know.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's nothing in here that should offend me compared to some of the movies that I watch and I do like a Rob Zombie movie.
Yeah.
I even enjoy movies like Cabin Fever, which if you know that movie,
Hmm.
it's not a pure flicks movie. It's pretty gross too. It's pretty vile.
Yeah.
I think it's always about what's the point to me. Like I could never understand the mission of this movie. I think I finally got to the heart of it. And should we just say we're in the negative section? I don't before I kind of like jump off on this rant. Is there anything else you want to bring up?
So there's definitely things that I liked about it, but I think I'm going to save those for a little later when we talk about the things that
That's
the
fair.
audience does not like.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in terms of what I don't like about this movie and what really made it a difficult watch for me is just I never understood the point. I never understood what Dan Aykroyd was going for. I didn't understand why he thought this was like a compelling vision, either as a comedy or a horror movie. I mean, and that's the thing. This weird mixture of tones for me is kind of like it's kind of the worst of both worlds. I thought it was really broad comedy a lot of the time, kind of like um, toilet humor, literally toilet humor sometimes.
At some points, yes.
Yeah, and then it was also like gross. Like I love House of a Thousand Corpses, and I love Texas Chainsaw Massacre too. But the gross out stuff there isn't why I like those movies. It's kind
Right.
of like the salt and pepper on the entree. And for me, this just didn't have any substance behind the vulgarity, the vulgarity of the ideas. You know, that was the substance that I could find was how weird and in your face and dare I say edgy can we go here? But I if I can transition to another point, yeah, I just didn't care enough about Chevy Chase's character, and maybe that was part of it. Maybe if I'd been invested on his journey or the stakes of his journey, that would at least be something I could follow as a through line, but I wasn't. I actually think that's a big problem is that, you know, the the story that they give him and Demi Moore's is very uninteresting to me. So now that I've said that, I want to hear your response as somebody who, you know, clearly has a different feeling about this movie.
Yeah, and you know, I will say that like a lot of what you said at the beginning, I don't know that I agreed with everything that you said
Mm,
there, but one thing that you said that I really resonated with, and it's one of the things I have written down here, is the shifts in tone throughout the movie.
mhm,
You know, and it's not exactly what you said, but going through what you said, it's like there are some dramatic shifts in tone in this film. In fact, there's one a group of scenes in particular where there's so we sort of go from Dan Ackroyd trying to kill Chevy Chase, who has escaped from his room, to moments later jamming to Digital Underground and telling Chevy Chase that he's going to marry his daughter and become the heir to his seat. And it's like it happens so dramatically that it almost sort of causes whiplash, you know, where it's like you just sort of wonder at this point of the movie like what is going on, you know.
mhm.
And so that's the thing for me that like even though I thought a lot of the comedic moments really did work for me and the things that were more so like God, you're gonna get so mad at me for saying this. The things that are the things that are more so what I like to call Toby Hooper humor. It's
Mhm.
something Rob Zombie uses a lot, where it's like this is funny because it's making me uncomfortable, or this is funny because it has subtext. And I was able to appreciate a lot of that a little bit differently than I think a lot of people in the audience did. However, the shifts in tone at certain points of the movie where we go from this is kind of disturbing or this is like a big stakes moment to like hey we're all light and jokey now
Yeah.
was a little too it went a little too fast and part of that could be the editing. I don't know. I would love to see the complete version of this film just to see how different it would be. But those shifts in tone did hurt for me. And another thing that I want to bring up, because you brought up Chevy Chase's character, and there were moments where I felt the same way, and I think a lot of it has to do with with the other point that I want to talk about here in the bad, and it's that there are certain moments where being out of their element for the cast really worked for the film, but there are other moments where it created a very awkward scene, you know,
Mhm.
where Chevy Chase's line delivery just wasn't quite there, or where we're supposed to be sort of involved in this storyline of growing love between our two main characters, and it's just a little awkward because of the things that are happening around it. And I think that's one of those things where like it's good to challenge your cast and to take them and put them out of their element to help what you're doing in the film. And I think for me, a lot of that worked. But in the moments where it didn't, man, it really stuck out for me. And that's a shame. I really hated to see that. In a weird way, like some of the scenes like changed the tone so much that like they could be in their element one moment and out of it the other. Like let's not forget there is a full performance by Digital Underground in this movie, which by the way features the very first feature film appearance of Tupac Shakur before he would go on to have a
Yeah.
very successful career in
He
music and
is
film.
I'm sorry, Tupac Shakur. I'm not familiar with the was did he go on to have a seminal career in hip hop before being tragically taken away from us at the all too young age of 26?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I didn't grow
I'm
up.
probably thinking of
I
somebody else.
didn't.
Sorry.
Yeah, I did not grow up religiously listening to Ambitions as a Rider, so I have no idea what we're talking about. Honestly, I just brought up the name because people online talk about it.
Yeah, two. Are you sure you're pronouncing it right? Isn't it
Tupac
Tupac?
Shaker, Tupac Shaker.
So it's so amazing because the only person whose career was not hurt by this movie was Tupac. He's
Weirdly,
like the only
yeah. I
person who
mean,
got bigger. I would
Well,
say.
in the realm of like, I mean, Digital Underground, I guess didn't have a huge upward swing after this, but
But I'm talking about
um,
him specifically.
no, him specifically. Like, if you look at each individual person's career, I think Demi Moore's got a little better after this, but
Really?
not, it.
Wasn't Ghost before this? I thought Ghost was kind of her peak.
Ghost was before this. People like this more than GI Jane, so or no, people don't like this more than GI Jane. People like GI Jane more than this, so that came
Okay,
after this.
keep Will Smith's name
I
out
didn't
your
say
fucking
nothing
mouth.
about Jada. I didn't say nothing about Jada.
Oh my
Please do
God.
not slap me. But no, like it's interesting because that is something that we do have to discuss about this movie and the fact that it really did hurt pretty much everybody that was involved and not directly per se in all cases, but like for Dan Aykroyd it definitely affected him directly.
Yeah.
I mean, this was the last time he would get behind the camera, and I think that's a shame. But I mean, it really is kind of staggering to think that the only person whose career really didn't go take a step down at all or didn't get huge after I mean, it was Tupac. I mean, and
Yeah.
he's a cameo.
And it helps that he doesn't have any lines. Or
He does. He I mean, he. I know he's definitely gives a
he
vocal
sings.
performance in the song, but I don't know that he.
By the
I
way,
don't know that he speaks any lines.
I should have mentioned the song in my positive because that little section, especially when Dan Aykroyd starts playing with
Oh
them, is
man,
kind of hilarious.
it's
That's kind of
awesome, isn't it?
fire.
It's a
Yeah.
great scene, man, and it just shows like the lighthearted nature that this film can take sometimes. Very out of nowhere, but
Sometimes, very sometimes.
yeah,
I mean, it's
there's not
interesting.
many lighthearted moments in the movie.
No,
We'll
I
get
mean,
that out there.
yeah, no, this did hurt people's careers in a similar way that Waterworld really hurt Kevin Costner's career. I mean, it's not like these people were never seen again. Dan Aykroyd
Right.
continues to act to this day. He was in the last
Yeah.
Ghostbusters movie. Chevy Chase had a pretty big comeback role until he fucked it up with Community.
Hmm.
And Demi Moore, again, I never followed her career closely, but I've never thought of her as box office poison or anything of the sort. So I think this movie is just more something that stalled people's momentum, um, and kind of represented maybe just the fact that they had hit their peak and now were sliding, you could say. And that's because I just think uh, here's the big thing, because I like to talk about movies not just how I feel about it. I like to think about how people experienced it and
Yeah.
what other people were feeling. The problem with this movie is that nothing about what you like about Dan Aykroyd or Chevy Chase is here. Particularly with Dan Aykroyd, who again, some of his ideas were out there, but my favorite Dan Aykroyd stuff is actually usually like the more kind of like subtle, a little more either restrained. Like I'm thinking like Blues Brothers, and performances like that.
Like
Ghostbusters.
Ghostbusters. Yeah.
Yeah. So him just chewing up the scenery in this disgusting makeup, being unrecognizable. Like it's cool that he didn't have the ego or vanity that he was. It's cool that he was willing to throw himself into a role like that. But I can't imagine being a Dan Aykroyd fan and getting your money's worth out of this. Same with Chevy Chase. Same with Demi Moore. The only person who I think brings the goods is John Candy.
Interesting. I'm actually gonna disagree with you there.
Okay, I would love to hear it. I would
I
love to hear it.
so one of the things that I like about Dan Aykroyd, and I think it's something that's really underappreciated about him, is his ability to both be a supporting character, somebody who makes you laugh every once in a while throughout, but is much more subtle, like you discussed. But I think watching back at his SNL skits and what he's been able to accomplish on Saturday Night Live, his loud and brash and in your face characters that were on that show uh, were really some of my favorite of his. When he was Two Wild and Crazy Guys. I mean, that was one that
Yeah,
really I think did well, and he had several roles on his during his tenure of SNL that I think on that show worked really well. And seeing him just go fucking apeshit on this movie. I mean, he just lost his
Mhm.
mind, had a ton of fun. I felt that in his performance, how much fun
Okay.
he was having.
I I'm hearing you and I'm agreeing with you to an extent, but let me say this or ask you this. Do you think
Ooh,
that part of what made those previous performances work was the fact that he was a part of a duo a lot of the time, that he was bouncing off of somebody's energy, like the Blues Brothers, like Two Wild and Crazy Guys. And in Ghostbusters, he's part of an ensemble cast, and here,
right.
he shares the screen with Chevy and a few other people, but I feel like he's kind of on an island in this movie.
I think in some ways he is, but for me, that does not hurt it. And I think the reason it doesn't hurt it for me is because, well, two reasons. First off, I just happen to really get Dan Ackroyd's sense of humor. I've
Mm,
always got it. And so even in, characters that maybe didn't resonate with too many people later on, I can't,
mm,
it's not like I can just name them off the top of my head or anything. But watching back on old episodes of SNL, there are definitely some characters that you don't remember from Dan Aykroyd. And there's some of the characters that were more him being crazy. And
yeah.
honestly, like, for me, those have always worked. And seeing that sort of by itself in a film, I do agree that most of him is on an island. I think he has much more of an opportunity to be sort of playing off of somebody in the role of Bobo in this. I don't know that that works for everybody. I'm curious to see if you think he works better in that role than he does
It's
as the
fine.
judge. But
I didn't even recognize him, so it wasn't like I was evaluating it. I
right,
was I was really more just, and maybe this is a problem actually. I was just more thinking about the effects. Like I wasn't even like watching those two guys as characters, as
okay.
performances. You know,
And hey, I mean that says a lot about the effects of this movie. I mean they were
which
very
it
well
does.
done. Yeah.
But here's the thing that a lot of people have to learn. A lot of directors have to learn is that focusing too much on effects can backfire. It can distract the audience, and it
Okay.
can, it can make it feel like the effects are the star and not you and not your actors. And that's kind of the case here.
Okay. See, for me, it was an enhancement. When I was
Okay.
watching the movie, I felt, I don't know if it's just because like, and that's the thing too. And I will say ahead of time, like Dan Aykroyd, John Candy, and Chevy Chase, I'm very biased with. I am. I love just about everything they do. Can't say that about Chevy Chase, because there's a few performances throughout there that is not good, and I definitely do not endorse his personal endeavors
Hmm.
throughout his career. However, or nor do I endorse the Chevy Chase show on Fox. However, I shouldn't have taken a shot at the Chevy Chase show. Um, uh, no, he can handle it. Anyways,
Can
um,
he though? Can he? I think we're kicking him while he's down.
well, here's the thing about Chevy Chase. Like, I think he was just there's been so many, and I think I do feel bad about taking a shot at the Chevy Chase show when talking about this movie because there's so many different performances that you can highlight, like the cast talking about how difficult he was to work with, and to
Mhm.
hear Dan Aykroyd talk about how important Chevy Chase was to the production of this film and how much fun everybody had on the production of this film. It makes me sad that it's not treated as such for everybody's career because of how it was and is seen to this day. Because this is an example of Chevy Chase being a model cast member in a lot of ways based on what Dan Aykroyd has said, and it's a case of somebody getting to see their vision all the way through. And to your point, I do think that there are things about Chevy Chase that are stripped away for this because of of the out of his element nature that this has. Um, but I didn't hate what we got, because I think some of that was still there. His line delivery was still there. His wit during certain scenes were still there. But he felt like a dude who was just thrown into a situation that who the fuck would know how to handle.
Mhm.
And and in some ways that worked. I did talk about how the awkwardness didn't, but um, it's interesting, man, because like I can definitely sympathize with the point that you said there, and I
Mhm.
don't want you to think that at all. I'd be discounting that because it's something a lot of people said about this. Everything I love about these actors is not in this movie, and a lot of people say that about John Candy too, which, man, that breaks my heart.
Well, it does
I
break my
love
heart,
that
but
guy.
it's not surprising when you get to the Alona role. Is that her name?
Eldona.
Eldona. Yeah. See, I'm not a fan of that type of humor though. I don't like making a joke out of sticking uh a large man in a dress and having him parade around as an ugly woman, like the huge dilemma of this movie, the stakes, if you will, is that Chevy Chase might have to sleep with this woman or die.
It's a side dilemma. It's not the main dilemma of the
Tell me what
film.
the okay. Tell me what the story is. See, that's something that we need to talk about though, if we're in the negative. Because for me, this was one of two big problems. This movie does not have a story. It is like a series of vignettes might be kind to it. It is, yeah. It's more like kind of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. But in this case, it's fecal matter, and all of it is sliding down the wall. Just ugly joke after ugly scene after ugly character. it it was a problem to me that the most I could even say about the story structure here is that at some point Chevy Chase has to decide if he'll marry Eldona. That's the closest I can give you to a climax.
Well, I'd like to sort of mend our sections together here because this is a huge complaint that the audience had about this
Makes
movie
sense.
is the writing. I
Yeah.
read so many reviews where the writing was bad, whether it's the dialogue or the story. And obviously those are two different things, but they're all sort of in the category of the writing of the film. And those are honestly two things that I not only didn't have a problem with, but I enjoyed. It's funny because when watching the movie, like, man, like I got it right away. Like, here's some people who didn't expect to be thrown into a crazy situation, and that situation keeps getting crazier and crazier at every twist and turn, and they learn throughout that they are in real serious danger with these people. But at the same time, the movie is treated like a comedy, and I think that's where it
Mhm.
gets lost on a lot of people, is that a lot of this gross out stuff and a lot of this stuff that's intended to that sort of seems out of nowhere or seems like it's there just to gross out the audience, I think for me added to the element of like, God, they are stuck in one big pile of shit right now. They are, man, like, how in the hell are they going to get out of this? And there is actually one scene in particular where I did not recall in my first viewing of this. I've only seen it twice. So thanks to Hats Off Entertainment for making me pick this. But and then there are a few scenes where I'm like, man, like this, they are just in the worst, the most dire of circumstances. And I got that part. But the comedy that they did throughout and some of those shifts in tone that I mentioned before don't make it feel as big of a threat as I think. I don't think people feel that threat as much as I did watching it. But I felt it. Like when watching the movie, I could tell, like, okay, this is a
Mhm.
movie about a bunch of normal people thrown into an abnormal place, and in being thrown into an abnormal place, it keeps getting worse and worse. And they realize they got to get the hell out of here before something happens to them. And that's the movie.
Mhm.
And that's why I think that scene with Eldona and with Chevy Chase, where they're going to be getting married and eventually do, is sort of like our side quest here because it's just another example of how these people's lives were so normal before this, and in a lot of ways, like they were just headed to Atlantic City to go deal with some sort of client of Demi Moore's, and
Can I just say
then
that is such a? I'm sorry, but
yeah,
before I forget, I've forgotten to bring this point up.
yeah,
And this doesn't sound like a big problem, but it kind of is. That
okay,
the initial reason why they're going out there to me was actually very lame. And I get that this
really,
is
okay,
just an excuse to get Chevy Chase and Demi Moore and their two Brazilianaire friends on the road, but that stuff matters. I actually think
hmm.
the hook you give your audience for why these characters are on a journey. Even in horror, it does matter. Like House of a Thousand Corpses, you know, it's not shooting for the stars in the character department, but those characters were. And I mean, Rob
No, you're
has
right.
been on
Yeah.
record saying that he once
Yeah,
said
you're right.
to the studio, nobody cares about the kids.
Right.
But at the very least, they're, I feel hooked by their journey, which is they're collecting, they're writing a kind of a book or a journal of all these unique sideshows. That gives this movie or that movie a little bit more air of kind of like an adventure, or that there's something intriguing already from the start to me. And there was like an era where for some reason it just like businessmen were the heroes of comedies. And it like the audience was dumped with way more financial lingo than they needed. This is actually a big problem I have with Trading Places. Like the entire
Oh.
third act of that feels like it should be in like Wall Street or something.
Oh. I like Trading Places a lot, actually.
I like it a lot, but I'm saying that is a problem I do have with it.
Okay.
In this movie, it's kind of like front loaded with that. Chevy Chase is he's not a banker, he's a financial publisher. And that just bored me to tears.
See, that's interesting because, like, as soon as I saw them start to take their trip, I actually really appreciated the way that they did it. And I'm not trying to go against you. I promise I'm not fucking with you
Now I
here.
would love to
Uh,
hear why. Maybe you can help me because I felt like I just wasn't getting the movie. Like there's something
okay.
kind of going over my head. So please tell me.
I hope I can. So the thing that I liked about it was that everybody had a different motivation to get them in that car, and that led to their actions within the situation that they were put in. So, like, let's think about it. So Demi Moore is the only one that really had a strong motivation to be going to Atlantic City. She needed to go
Mm-hmm.
meet up with this client. It was a dire circumstance. She's clearly frustrated about it. She's got to get there, and that's one thing. But Chevy Chase, I mean, there's no other way to say it. He's just trying to get some pussy. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get laid. So he offers to take her, and actually almost does not go on the trip due to his hangover. But he ends up offering to take her. He ends up taking her there, and he still has the same motivations. Well, the other people misunderstand what's happening, and they wish to go on this big adventure and go see all these expensive things that this investment writer is doing. And so each of them have their own motivations of being on the trip. So when it comes time to sort of nut up or shut up, you have this guy who's sort of used to a life of luxury who ends up putting them into a worse situation by sort of hurting their circumstances. He's very tired of this. He's not used to having to show patience with things, so he doesn't, and they get put in they get literally a trapdoor opens underneath them and puts them into a pile of like squeaky toys. But the Demi Moore's character has a different motivation. She at this point is starting to fall for this guy, but at the end of the day, she's the one who got them into this situation. So when she has a part where she can leave, she's trying to find a way to get back to him, to get him out of there. That informs her decisions in the movie. With our friends from South America, that informs their decisions for the reason that they were there. They just get tired of this. They're not going to play this game anymore, and they try to get out of there. And that ends up leading to them escaping. Their motivations for leaving were to go back to their life of luxury, and they were able to lure John Candy's character away by offering this life of luxury. And so each of them, with their own motivations, had different ways that they tried to get out of this house, different ways that they had reasons to try to get out of this house. And with Chevy Chase's character, I mean, who's to say that he would have been so mad about either dying or marrying Eldona if he hadn't have started to. The whole reason that he's on this trip is because of a girl that he just
Really?
met. So no, I think he would have been upset by it, but I mean, it played up for the comedy 100%. But what I'm trying to say is that every time that something happened in the movie, I could see it as a part of their motivation to be where they are, to get out of the situation that they're in, and for their personalities. Until we get to the part where Chevy Chase is just the hero, and I think that's the case with almost any movie where you have a hero. Some of those motivations start to get lost. Like when, I mean, still his motivation is to be the hero and to save this girl that he's trying to get with, but so that, I mean, that doesn't necessarily change, but it becomes a little muted when he's like causing explosions in this junkyard to save her life. But I don't know, man, it worked for me. I like the fact that each person had a different reason to be in that car, and that informed some of the decisions that they made that put them where they were,
That's
and either
really,
got them
I
out
don't
of it
know.
or stayed in.
That doesn't feel that different. I mean, it's vaguely different. I don't think if that's how you kind of felt watching the movie, then cool. Like these characters have different motivations that makes them actually play like a different role in the story.
Yeah,
To me, I felt no such thing. I felt
that's
like
fair.
they were all just it was just a cat and mouse game of survival for each and every one of them. I think they could have had much stronger motivations for going on
That's
that
fair.
journey. At least Chevy Chase and Demi Moore. I don't really care about the Brazilianaires. They leave halfway through the movie. I actually don't even understand why they were there in the first place. Story wise, like from a screenwriting perspective, why were these characters there? I was sure they would die in like a creative fashion, but no, no, it just felt like Dan Ackroyd put a lot of time trying to come up with this crazy world and these wacky ideas. And some of that pays off because there are genuinely like clever or at the very least kind of like out of the box thinking
Yeah.
concepts throughout the movie. And some of them made me chuckle. Some of them kind of made me cringe in the right ways because he is going for that kind of gross out effect. But that means that I don't get the sense at all that he thought much about characters, about structure, or about pacing. That's how I felt about this movie on my first viewing. Maybe if I went back and kind of watched it with the way that you just outlined, maybe I would start to see those things. I just did not even get that vibe, to be honest.
And that's fair. And that's one of the things that, like, reading the reviews and seeing that the writing was a complaint, that's one of the things I put down in the good section. And I
Hmm.
wanted to save it until this point. Because I don't, there's not a moment in the movie that made me laugh accidentally, that was like, oh, that's so bad, I'm going to laugh at it, because there are movies that we've covered that has happened in. There's also movies that I could not even smile during because it was so awful to watch. Specifically, the last movie that we watched for this show. But in watching this one, man, like I appreciated all of the acting, or I'm sorry, all of the writing in this. There are certainly things that I might have done differently, but I dug it. For overall, it was a pro for me.
Hmm.
I'm sad to see that it was a hint of the bad for you, and that the audience also felt the same way. But I'm curious if you have anything else that you wanted to highlight for yourself, or if you just kind of wanted to talk about a couple of the other things that the audience really does not like about this.
Yeah, let's talk about what other people felt. I want to know if I'm in the minority, if maybe my feelings overlap with the audience. Maybe I can defend this movie. I wouldn't be surprised because some people don't like wacky or weird humor under any circumstances, and I certainly will defend Dan Aykroyd's right to be weird and off-putting.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to discuss a little bit is something that we discussed sort of throughout the movie about how we felt about this, but I want us to go a little bit more in depth about how we feel about this because almost these exact words were used in a lot of reviews I read, both from
Mhm.
critics and from users on Letterboxd, which we use to curate our ratings and get it set for us. But um, a lot of people talked about how they felt like the acting was almost lazy in this, that the cast was phoning it in. Besides Dan
Mhm.
Ackroyd, I mean, specifically, this complaint falls into the lap of Chevy Chase, Demi Moore, and John Candy, and that those are the names that I saw in this complaint. Um, I will be real because I don't have much to say about it. Honestly, I don't see that complaint at all. I
Mhm.
definitely see moments where they don't necessarily belong with the material. Not in a conceptual sense, but you can feel the awkwardness. But I'm curious if you agree with that at all. Do you feel like anybody sort of phoned it in
Look, I
for
have
this?
seen Chevy Chase phone it in many, many times.
Oh, you mean you've
This
seen
was
the
not that.
Vacation reboot in the 2010s?
I No, so
Oh
I
shit.
alluded to this earlier, and I feel pretty right about this. That I think Chevy Chase wanted to make this work. I think he was just confused. Again, he's working with a first-time director with material that it must have felt very foreign to him. He's never been the hero of a weird, psychotic, backwoods family survival movie before.
Yeah.
Three amigos. This is not. So,
Vacation, this is not.
like we've said, this is out of his element. And I actually remember hearing a quote from him that he did not like the script, at least not the dialogue, but he thought he could fix it through improvisation. And I definitely could tell which was an ad lib line and which was scripted. Um, I think he's better when he sticks to the scripted material, because when he ad libs, it just feels like he's kind of blowing off the material. So I can understand why audiences felt that way about Chevy, but that's not the problem that I diagnosed. I just think he did not get it. I didn't get it, so I can't blame him. But
Oh
Demi Moore,
man.
actually, I want to really defend her because I don't see that at all. I think she's like kind of giving it 100%.
Dude, I think she kind of kills it in this. Like I can't point to a single moment where I thought she was bad, and I even like appreciated the scenes where she's locked in a. Okay, let me just give some so for somebody who hasn't seen this, who maybe isn't planning on it or maybe wanted to hear our thoughts before diving into this. Sorry about the spoilers, but like let's just talk about one of the just the most insane concepts of a scene in this movie. There is a scene where Demi Moore is locked in a cage in a junkyard in this destroyed town. And
Yes, she
while
is.
in said cage, she is playing cards with two overgrown gigantic babies. I'm not making this up. This actually happens in the movie, and she makes it endearing, dude. Like
I
she
agree.
talks to them like she is their friend, and their comedy really works in that scene. She's like the glue that keeps some of this shit together, because I'm going to be honest with you, despite all the great things that I've said throughout this, it's fucking weird, dude, in the best way and in the worst way. This movie's fucking weird. And there are certain moments where I think that even people who appreciate this can be taken out a little bit, or take at least, for in my case, at least taken aback a little bit by the weirdness of this. But that scene just feels so weirdly normal, and the way I've just explained it is like, why, how, in what world is that a normal scene? But she like elevates it somehow. I don't know, man. It's weird. Like I thought she did
Mhm.
really well in this.
Yeah, I really don't have a bad thing to say about her. In fact, she holds things together better than Chevy does. I feel like uh, again, she felt game for anything, for any joke.
Yeah.
Um, and there is an endearing quality to a performance in scenes like that. I don't think there are enough scenes like that. I could have used more. That would have given a little bit more heart to the movie. Like if this were about these snooty rich people arriving to and that's another thing maybe I should have elaborated on. Some of this feels like a smug kind of like looking down
Oh.
on rural people, like because we got Chevy Chase, who you know and he's playing a businessman, very luxurious lifestyle. He goes out to Nowheresville, and oh my god, these people are hicks. They're ugly. They're backwards. I'm not trying to cancel the movie. I'm just saying scenes like what you described would have actually given the movie a little bit more heart, instead of this kind of like kind of snubbing your nose at the little people sort of thing.
See, it's funny because like there were moments where I felt like they were definitely doing that. But there's also like I feel it's so weird, man. Like I sort of feel like I'm crazy reading the reviews for this. Because like there's so many reviews that I read that said that this movie had no heart, and I was like, what are you talking about? Because there were so many moments throughout that I was like, man, this movie's got so much charm. It's got so much heart to it. And I just I there's don't get me wrong, there's definitely some mean spirited shit in there. Okay, like this movie, the concept of it basically was born off of two things. The fact that Dan Ackroyd was once pulled over and summoned to a court in a small town, just like this, and nightmares that he's had. So like this is not. There's gonna be some mean spirited shit in there. Clearly, the inspiration for this breeds that sort of attitude during certain scenes of this movie, and I feel like it sort of has to have it in some places. And I'm not saying that's something that should have been there, but with how the movie was moving, it sort of had to be in there to give you a scope and a sense of how ridiculous the situation that these people are caught in is. But I don't know, man. Like I felt like there were, and that scene is one of them. I mean, like who would have thought, just hearing what that scene is, that there would be any heart behind it? And I feel like that's how it is through a couple of scenes in the movie.
Yeah, look,
And I know you won't agree, but
yeah, I'm
I
more
just had to throw
inclined
that
to
out there.
agree with those reviews, frankly.
I
This movie
understand.
did not have enough heart. I mean, compared to the Blues Brothers, that movie's got soul.
I mean, it's kind of hard to compare those movies. I mean, they're completely different
Well,
types
I'm
of
gonna
movies,
do it
though.
anyways because I'm a dick.
No, hey, look, no, and and look, like I speaking with you about how you felt about certain things of this movie so far has sort of opened my brain up to how people could think that way now. Because
Hmm.
when I was reading the reviews, I was much less like, I literally at one point looked up today. I was working at my day job, and I just sort of looked up at one point from reading my phone. I was on a break, and I was like, what are they talking about? You know, like I was like, what are they even talking about? And hearing you talk about it, I can sort of get it. I can get how it it's funny, man. Like this is one of those movies that I feel like has to click with you, and if it doesn't click with you, it's really not going to click.
That could be very right. And Lord knows we know all about those movies. Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 reference.
Thumbs up. Thank you. Holy shit, thank you. I'm glad we got that in there.
Yeah. We almost forgot in Waterworld, and you kind of saved
Yes.
our ass at the last second.
I got
Um,
you.
and this sort of movie kind of even defies reviewing. Um, you know what I mean? Because it's so much about just a feeling. Like maybe Dan Aykroyd really did want to nail the story and the characters, but to me, I think he is chasing a feeling and trying to put it on screen. A feeling of being like, it's almost Kafkaesque, right? Being trapped in like a surreal place, being isolated, being alone, being afraid, and maybe thinking something is so ridiculous that the only choice you have is to laugh. I think he is chasing a feeling. So if that is a compelling feeling to you, then I can see how you forgive a lot of these blemishes in the screenwriting, and some of the other just conceptual designs of this story,
Or can interpret things in different ways too.
or you
I
can
saw a
interpret
lot of
choices in
reviews
different ways.
where people I've read some reviews back to back where somebody would praise something and then the next review would talk about how awful it was. Movies
Sure.
like this I think breed that kind of reaction,
This is the kind of
if you
movie
can say
where
that.
I'm sure there are fans of this. I'm sure there are people who think this is a masterpiece. That's one of Dan Aykroyd's best. People that
I've
love
read
it
that.
the same way that I love Rob Zombie's Halloween 2.
Oh yeah.
Um, like I can totally imagine why somebody would have that feeling. Um, to me, it was just more guttural and nuts. I mean, there was nothing cerebral about this movie to me. There was nothing like kind of thought provoking or questions I asked myself. It just felt like a very unpleasant carnival ride. Like somebody threw up in my seat, and you're going through, and the conductor is taking a piss on the wall, and it felt like that more than any kind of statement.
Well, and that sort of gets into one of the audience's other complaints, and it's one I wanted to make sure that I brought up here. And it's
Mhm.
it's a complaint that Roger Ebert actually had about this movie as well, and it's that this movie's just like gross and it's very ugly to look at. I saw a lot of people talk about how um, they could not, that there are movies that they may have seen that they could redeem by how good the movie looks, and that this is the complete opposite. It hurt the movie with how it looked. Um, that was a little surprising to me, and I'm curious if you fall into that category at all, because I did hear you praise the production design earlier, but did some of those gross and ugly elements about the design and this movie hurt your enjoyment of the film? Do you feel like it's a of course, like any decision could be justified, but is that something that you follow along with? Is that something you agree with the audience on?
I did praise the production design and the makeup effects.
Right.
I praised it. I'm praising it in a very technical way. I mean, no, it's not pleasant to look at. It's gross. How can you disagree that's gross? I mean, that's not even the question. The question is,
Right.
does the grossness create an immersive experience, or does it repel the audience? It's like really interesting, right? Like The Fly, David Cronenberg's The Fly,
Mhm.
objectively is a gross movie. It's got
Very much so.
horrific scenes, and it's a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest love stories ever told. It's one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. Um, and to me, all of those disgusting visuals aided in all of the themes. And um, that's a movie where I'm like, okay, I completely understand why I'm being subjected to these images. This is all adding up to a really great vision. And that is something that I just think Nothing But Trouble completely lacks. So I hope
Okay.
that kind of answered your question. It's kind of twofold. I mean, if you're into this kind of stuff, like it's kind of like I'm not into the Jackass movies, but am I going to say like I would know better than to say, oh, this is just trash and
Right.
nobody should ever watch this. It's a taste thing.
Well, and that's the thing too, and that comes down to the interpretation part that we discussed about how people could interpret this movie in different ways. For you and for much of the audience, the gross out nature and the features that were more ugly to look at were not an enhancer for you. I mean, the part that enhanced it for you was the technical aspect of which they made those gross out
Mm.
effects, not so much how they were used. And in my sense, and I think this is something that this is one of the most interesting episodes that we've done because I find myself disagreeing with that.
Mm.
I am on that side that sees it as an enhancement for the film. There are definitely parts that you're just like, oh, good lord, okay, that's where we're going with this. In fact, there's one scene where we find that the nose is prosthetic and of Dan Aykroyd's Judge
Right.
character, which he takes off, and I was really taken aback by that. I did not expect that to happen, and I had seen this movie before, so that shows you really how much I retained from my last viewing, which honestly wasn't much. And I want to stress that too, like I had seen this movie one time. I didn't pay too much attention to it. I had seen certain parts and I laughed at those certain parts, but everything else I didn't retain. And it was similar to our Batman Forever episode. I picked that one as well. And a lot of that was due to a YouTube channel called Hats Off Entertainment. Weirdly enough, and this is total coincidence because Gabe came up with the name, and he's never. I'm sure you've never heard of Hats Off Entertainment, but he has a series called "It's Not That Bad," where he talks about movies similar to this. I didn't know of this until after I started this show, but he covered this movie, and I was like, "Man, I really got to watch this again, and I really got to pick this for the show because I think it'd be interesting."
Man,
Because I did have an original pick for this.
that guy hated on the Munsters, Rob Zombie's The Munsters, and
Oh, he did.
he
Yeah,
defended this movie.
I did not
That's
watch that video, by the way.
very interesting is the nice word, so I'll go with that. Okay.
His opinions are definitely interesting because they fall on different categories, and he's opened me up to a lot of things that I wouldn't have seen, but he's also said some things that I don't really agree with, and I think
Which
that's the beauty of
I
this.
imagine that's how people watch this show.
Yes. Oh, of
Like,
course. I mean,
whoa, these guys, they're defending what?
Yeah. Oh
They're
my, I mean, how many times have we done a movie that has had like, like that's the thing. So many of the movies that we've covered so far, some of them are like, oh, okay, I could see how they'd pick that. Like I think like Van Helsing, Terminator 3, like those are kind of movies that like somebody could be like, yeah, I could
in
get
the
how
middle.
somebody,
Yeah.
but like when we talk about like Halloween 5 or like Friday the 13th, The New Blood, or
When we make a running gag out of how much we love Rob Zombie. So, I mean,
yes, and Halloween Resurrection is a big example of another one that we covered. That's just like,
it's
and
all
a lot of
fair
these are
game.
thanks, yes, and a lot of
Yeah.
them, of course, are thanks to me because I have bad taste, and I have bad takes. But in
I
all
have the worst
seriousness,
taste and the worst takes.
well,
Um,
that's what I like about us. That's why this
yeah.
show is so perfect for us. But I, in saying that, like this movie is, there's so many things that clicked for me that didn't click for everybody else, and the gross out factor is actually a strong point in one of those things. I love that this is an over the top comedic version of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie just set in New Jersey.
But we already have that. I guess that's also my problem is this movie kind of
I
feels a
can see
little
that.
redundant to me. Like there's a movie called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and I'm sorry, its imagination and creativity is vast compared to this film to me.
So that's that's where this is an interesting conversation, I think, because I am a huge, huge fan of Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. I might like it as much as the first one. I mean, like,
There's an argument for that.
really, I really love it because I think it's one of those movies where like I think Toby Hooper almost said like, "Oh, you didn't get the humor that I put in the first one? Well, fucking take a bite of this because I'm gonna put all of that in there and do it in an over the top way." And for me, like watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, which inspired one of my favorite horror films of all time, not one of my highest rated, but like one of my favorites, my comfort movie in House of a Thousand Corpses. Yes, that is a comfort movie for me. That shows you a little glimpse into my personality. It's like it's imagination taken to the next level. You know what I mean? Where it's like, yes, there's something that inspired this. That's how I feel about House of a Thousand Corpses. It was definitely inspired by Toby Hooper's style of filmmaking, whether it be Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, The Funhouse, which we discussed on your
Mm-hmm.
podcast before we had this show. There's so many things that we can sort of talk about with those comparisons with Nothing But Trouble. I mean, the fact that Nothing But Trouble was originally supposed to have a lot more horror elements, which were cut out. It was also called Vulcanvania before it was called Nothing But Trouble. Nothing But Trouble is a throwaway line in this movie that they just
It's a
picked as the
terrible
title
title.
because, well, and that's the thing too is like I wonder how much of this was due to two factors, and one of those is the editing, and the other is the marketing. If you cut out a lot of the horror elements that were designed to be there, that's a lot of context and a lot of content that's gone from the film. And if you then market it as this hardcore, hilarious comedy film, how many people are going to go into that and just be fucking blown away in the worst way possible by the gross out stuff in this? This was very much marketed and like a low key comedy film, and that's why it didn't do too awful at the box office at first. It was going up against some pretty stiff competition. Like Home Alone came out just before this, and
Mm-hmm.
there were some other movies around that time that were doing really well. So this opened
I
up, I think,
think
at number eight.
Pretty Woman was
Um,
around this.
yeah, and I think this opened up at number 8 on opening weekend, and it didn't do awful at the box office, but the critics destroyed it, and I wonder how much of. I guess that's my next question, because do you think this film could have benefited from more elements of horror and less marketing towards this is a comedy film when it comes to the critics? Not so much for your enjoyment. Maybe the horror
Uh,
elements could have helped that, but do you think the critics would have taken this differently?
this was at a time when critical reception to horror was just at in a really sad state. Like
Pretty
movies
abysmal.
that we consider classics now of the genre were just being shat on, dismissed. Um, it was a really bad time to be a horror movie if you were looking for a, critical approval. You
Right.
know, Roger Ebert, no better example. I love the man; he's a hero of mine. But I mean, there's just no getting around the fact that he was extremely dismissive when it came to horror movies,
Right.
especially when it came to stuff that was that was more about like kind of like excess and grossness, all of those things. So no, it would not have helped the critical reception. It might have given it a different kind of life at the box office because then you could have attracted the weirdos like
Yeah.
you and me. Because like let me tell you this, I would not have gone to see this in the theater if I were around in 1991. Because and I haven't really disclosed this, but I'm not a big Dan Ackroyd fan. I think
Oh.
he's a hit or miss guy, to put it lightly. And at this point, the ratio is so bad that I would have strong apprehension about
Oh wow.
seeing one
Okay.
of his movies. Right? I would need to go to see it on the merit of word and mouth, and that's just not something this movie had. That being said, I would be extremely intrigued if somebody said, "Hey, man, like, uh, how to sum this up?" Um, the
Oh
guy who
man.
played Jimmy Carter on SNL came out with this like body horror movie. It's kind of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Do you want to go see that? I'd be like, well, I have to go see it now.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what's funny about it too is like I'm really when I heard about this lost footage that Warner Brothers cut out of the movie, and I know why they did it. I mean, they did it because of the reception that horror movies got and the stigma behind horror that was still there in 1991, despite several box office successes. Um, they definitely didn't want to be associated with it, and they dimmed the movie down. And it's one of those things where it's like, man, you got to wonder about these studios. Like, would this film have come out in its intended form today? Like, would I obviously this is a very of the times movie. I mean, fucking Digital Underground is in this. Like, this is a time capsule, okay? But and by the way, Dan Ackroyd made a point to reach out to Digital Underground themselves to provide the track. He commissioned it from them. He was a big fan of theirs. He wanted them in this movie, and he was in
Pretty
their
cool.
music video for the song for free as a return. So very cool to see. Very cool to see him implement hip hop culture to the film. I'm curious to see if that culture has any feelings about this movie based on the fact that it's the first film appearance of Tupac Shakur. I'd be interested if anybody out there belongs to that community more than I do that can say. But
Oh, dude, like I bet freaking Drake has a nothing but trouble poster on
Oh,
his wall.
100%. But what's
Yeah.
interesting about this is like one of the things that I learned, because obviously we were not even thought of when this film came out.
Nope.
We were born in 1998. For a lot of people, that's too young, but fuck you. I think we're old enough at this point to go past that. Let's look past the fact that we were born in the late 90s. Um, but
So
it's funny
hostile.
because like
Just nobody.
no,
Nobody
yeah,
said anything to us
fuck you, everybody.
about being too young. Okay.
No, but like in all seriousness, like it's funny to think of like what this reaction would look like, and I read a lot of reviews that talked about the fact that like HBO in the early 90s, early to mid 90s would run this movie all the time. I mean, like all the time. People talked about like that's how their introduction was. My uncle, born in the 80s, um, grew up on this movie. Like he saw it on television because it would just play a ton on HBO. And it makes me wonder like is that where and this is the thing about it, man. Like I don't think it's a cult movie right now. I do think it could get there. Let's give this the not that bad bump, and get it above a 3 because everybody should go up there and follow this movie in the cult status. But like if that movie would have continued to do so, like so many movies have over the years, like the Halloween films that just continue to play on television every year, would that change the trajectory of this movie?
I
Because
just
a
don't know
lot
who
of the
the
people that
audience
grew
is.
up watching it
You know,
still love it to this day.
maybe I just don't know who the audience is. That's the problem. I
Me.
don't know who this was. Well, maybe if we perfect cloning and
Hey,
you can
man.
get like a million Connors to flood the television waves and things like that, buy a million copies of this movie. Uh, it's always going to be a there's always going to be a ceiling to this
Right.
movie's appeal, and there's not really any shame in that because this was a truly experimental film. Um, from somebody who kind of put it all on the table
Yeah.
to see this vision through. And those movies don't usually get the kind of reappraisal that we see of a thing like The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yeah.
But that means it'll always have a certain clout um, with people like yourself who admire all of the boldness to this movie. I'm sort of caught in the middle where I see the audacity and I appreciate it, but I didn't like it. Right.
Okay.
And I think I kind of represent the ceiling of people who are just never going to really warm up to this movie. Um, and why I think, what do you call something that's below a cult status? Like cult adjacent, cult?
Um,
Yeah.
Almost cult classic.
Yeah.
We'll take a page out of Hats Off Entertainment's
As,
book, and we'll say almost cult classics.
instead of almost famous, like the movie, it's like almost
Yeah,
cult classic.
almost cult classic. Yeah.
Yeah. That'd be a good title for this show.
Well,
Almost cult classics.
yeah, I
Yeah.
will say
So,
Hats Off Entertainment will have us beat on that one because he does already have that. So
oh, does he? I don't
he
watch.
does
I
he
watch him
does
enough.
have that as a series. He covered a movie that I have on my list and may cover in the future on this show. We'll get into that later,
Jeez, all right.
privately. But
I thought we were a rip off of like Red Letter Media at first, but no, we're a rip off of Hats Off
Hats Off
Entertainment.
Entertainment, right? Yeah, God, if he sees this, man, I don't know if we're gonna get sued or a high five. I don't.
I doubt
No,
we're gonna get a high five.
we are definitely not ripping anybody off here, and I like that. Like, that's the thing too, is like this movie or this show. Motivations for picking these movies can be very interesting. I mean, Waterworld, your pick for Waterworld had a very interesting motivation, and that episode turned out very interestingly. And mine for this breeded another interesting episode. And unless you have any objections, I think we could get into our final verdicts.
I think we've truly dissected this movie like a frog.
I think so.
And
Yeah,
and
this
like
might
a
be one of the
frog,
deepest dives that we've taken into a
yeah.
movie.
And like dissecting a frog, it's gross, but it's educational. And I
Yeah, well.
feel yeah. Okay.
Oh,
Let's do
shit.
it. All right. So since this was your pick, who goes first?
I'd like to hear your final verdict first. I want to see. I think I know where you're going to be, but I'd like to hear some of the things that you have to say about it. And by the way, anybody coming to our show for the first time who has an awful memory like I do, we have 4 potential ratings that a film can land on for us personally. It's either it's that bad, it's not that bad, it's actually good, or it's actually great. Not many movies have reached that distinction. Let's see where you land today. I think we may know, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. So this is
just
actually
please don't open up with Einstein's theory of relativity again.
No, no,
If you
no,
do,
no. Because there's nothing to compare this movie to, right?
That's fair.
It's
Yeah.
relative to nothing. This
Yes.
is the anomaly,
Right.
in my theory of relativity. So this might actually be a case where I'm a little, where my opinion has changed throughout the course of this conversation. When I got done watching this movie, I was really ready to say some mean things about it. I did not enjoy it. I was just left wondering why anybody would fund this, why Dan Ackroyd would put everything on the line for this. And I just didn't have much sympathy for him because I just thought this was such a misguided project. But hearing the opinions of somebody who had a different perspective, had a different experience with this film, while I can't agree with all of the pros you had, and while
Right.
I stand by many of my criticisms, some things that I thought were just ugly and mean spirited, I do see now as an attempt to appeal to a new audience for Dan Aykroyd, the horror audience,
Yeah.
And this was at a time when there was a market for that. And I think he was being experimental, that his heart was in the right place, but it's a failed experiment for me. So
Okay.
I understand why audiences rejected it. That being said, when I see people like Roger Ebert's review of this movie, Roger Ebert, who apparently asked hecklers in the theater to heckle louder so he didn't have to
Yes.
hear the film, I do have to say, Roger, it's not that bad. I'm probably never going to rewatch this movie, but
Ooh.
I think the sneering that this movie has endured actually kind of flipped me around. And hey, I don't think the movie deserves that. I certainly don't think this is the worst thing that any of these people have done on the cast and crew. It's interesting. It's an interesting little flick. I'm glad it exists. So we can study it and learn from its madness.
So, yeah, very, very, very surprised where you landed on this because, in a weird way, man, this is almost like our episode with Child's Play 3. I started that
Yeah,
ready to go
that's
in
right.
and say that it was that bad, by the end of it, I said it was not that bad, and by today, dude, that movie's only grown on me even more. I like it even more than I did. Then I'd probably even raise the rating a little bit if our rating system was different back then, but. With this movie, um, man, this is a strange one because there is no movie that I can definitively say is just like this one. There are a lot of movies where you can say like, oh, it's kind of like this, but this is different, or it's kind of like this, but this is different. Um, I cannot definitively say that there is a movie that has gross out humor in the most horrific possible way 1 second, and then at the end of the movie has a running through the wall outline gag. I can't say that that's been in the same movie ever. So it's really interesting, man. This movie is insanely unique, and the plot is just insane. Everything about
Hmm.
this movie is just insane. I wasn't sure where I'd land on this before I picked it. But I'm happy to say that despite the tonal shifts that could give you full on whiplash, and despite several strange things about this movie, man, I had a ton of fun watching this. I had a ton of fun. I was laughing throughout the scenes that I was supposed to be laughing. I was in awe of some of the makeup effects and the set design throughout the parts that I wasn't laughing. This is a movie that I just got and that it just clicked with me. And it was such a good experience that I'm going to be watching this movie a lot moving forward. Like, this is one that I will continue to watch on for years to come. This is a movie that I will recommend by flying colors to everybody that I can, whether I think they would like it or not. I just want them to experience this at least once. This and Hausu are those two movies for me. And Man, like, this movie is actually good. I can't go actually great. I really want to go there, but it's not. There are things that do hold it back. There are flaws that didn't necessarily bother me, but did add up throughout the movie that
Hmm.
did cause it to sort of. I like to think that every time I watch a movie, I start it at actually great, and then things affect it and move it down. There wasn't
Hmm.
enough to get it to a not that bad, but man, I'm excited to watch this movie in the future. It's awesome. I love it. I cannot say to you confidently that it is a great movie, but I can confidently tell you that it is actually good compared to what people have said.
Okay,
It's an
well,
actual
I'm
good movie.
a lot more positive than our Waterworld episode.
Yeah, this really did surprise me.
Yeah. Um, I mean, when it comes to a movie that's been out for so long and it's had time to gestate and marinate, and uh, it's just one of those things where it's like I don't think about it the same way I think about like a movie that just came out. I think about
Yeah,
legacies, and I think this movie does have a legacy um, that it's earned. Right? I think it's going to be cool to see more people kind of discover this, and maybe we'll get a Shout Factory Blu-ray of this one day or something
we
like that.
do. We do
Wait, is
have
there
one.
already one?
It's through one of Shout's. Dude, I'm not even kidding, and this is not a bit for the show. I have it in my Amazon cart right now. Um, there is a Blu-ray of this movie that was released through um, Shout Select. Shout Factory
Okay.
Select is the little label that they're calling it. It is available on Amazon, and it is one I will be buying. There's supposedly new commentary from, or at least an interview with Dan Ackroyd. Yeah, new interview with Dan Ackroyd, new interview with actor Chevy Chase. Um, and other actors. Then there's commentary with pop culture historian Russell Dyball. So if you are in the market for a ridiculous movie that is unlike anything you've ever seen before, pick up a copy of the Blu-ray for nothing but trouble. I would really recommend it to anybody out there who just wants to watch a movie that they've never experienced before. See where you land on it. I don't think anybody. I would hope nobody would think it's a complete waste of time, but I would also hope that more of you would come out on a positive side. And hopefully, if you've never seen this and you did decide to listen to this episode all the way through, despite many spoilers that might have come through, that you do still give it a shot. And if you maybe liked some of the points we made, go revisit it if you've already seen it. I would love to hear people's opinions on this.
All right. Well, that's what this podcast is all about. And
Yes.
on that note, I think we are ready to close out.
Yes.
All right, y'all. So thank you so much for joining and listening to us talk about, I don't know, maybe the weirdest movie.
I would say so. This might be the weirdest movie we ever cover.
I am Gabe.
I am Connor.
This is Not That Bad. Signing out.